Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Alex Roy, Director of Special Operations Argo AI. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Well, that's a very nice introduction, but you should also say that I'm the founder of the Human Driving Association and the Autonocast and thedrive.com. And my views do not represent Argo AI on this show.
Do your views represent NoHo Sound?
Well, we could talk about NoHo Sound, but that's more of a hobby and vanity project.
Yeah. You have a lot of titles, but pulling back the titles, you're an incredible dad and an incredible individual who really understands this technology better than any other individual. So thanks for driving up here today because I'm really excited to dive into this conversation.
I don't know if I understand the technology better than any other individual, but probably better than people who used to be skeptical of it. Like as a convert, I think I'm probably one of the most enthusiastic and educated converts.
You're well-educated. You're more than well-educated. You know how to articulate and deliver a message, and you know how to build a brand. And you started building this brand in 2007 when you broke the U.S. Cannonball Run in a BMW M5. Talk about that adventure.
I mean, you're really buttering me up. I feel like I'm being tricked. The Cannonball Run record, which is something I'm constantly trying not to talk about, is relevant in this way. I've always been obsessed with things that people said were impossible. So if someone says something is impossible, I want to try it. Or as an investor, I want to invest in it because, the future is always built by optimists. The Cannonball record was something that I grew up hearing about. I'd seen the movies, and it became clear as I became an adult that it was not a foot to the floor thing you should go do. It was it was a problem that could only be solved quantitatively. And it was very much a data problem. I didn't know anything about self-driving cars at the time, or even driver assistance. I just knew that it was 2,811 miles from New York to LA, and that weather and traffic were going to be issues. And then tire quality and road surface quality. And then if you could mitigate the risks around all those things, if you are going to break the speed limit, that there were ways to mitigate the risk of being caught. So that was when I first learned about mapping and started paying attention to things like sensors and radar and LiDAR. To do it required an understanding of the types of radar that are used for traffic monitoring and surveillance, as well as lasers that are used by law enforcement to measure speed, and mapping, which is used to not just plot your route, but things like terrain. For example, if you want to drive from New York to LA, there are only really 5 or 7 traffic lights. There are only so many places police may hide. If you drive cross country, as I did, slowly, and record video, and then at the time, Google Maps, which did not exist, Google Earth did. It had previously been the Keyhole mapping project, been a DARPA and a Pentagon project, used Google Earth and taking the video of driving cross country, which 2/3 at night on a practice run, and then on another screen, going into Google Earth and marching down the highway, matching up the video to Google Earth car point of view, which is always daytime, and then matching that up to the locations of signals from the radar detector. You could begin to correlate where there were shopping centers you couldn't see at night, where police might be hiding at night. And so from those 3 things, you can then create a data set, what's called a KML or KMZ file. And then you can plot the latitude and longitude of potential hiding places for police. You could also do the same thing for construction zones. So this is 16, 17 years ago. We created these map data sets around road construction, road conditions, police locations, and then looked at NOAA, the National Weather Service, and looked at weather and created a very comprehensive data set and plan as to how to get from New York to LA faster than anyone else as safely as possible. And after several attempts and failures, hardware failures, we had a fuel pump failure, which led to us breaking down halfway. We eventually did break the record. I had no idea at the time what that would mean or how it might change my life. But when the story of what we did came out in Wired magazine, we shared with Wired the Google Earth KML file. And that file was downloaded over 250,000 times in the first week after we went public. And I was instantly approached by multiple companies, including Piaggio, who wanted to know how they could create content in Maps. At that point, Google Maps was now becoming more popular. And I got hired to create content around drives by Piaggio motorcycle riders, embedding YouTube videos and content and data into Google Maps. I don't know if we were the first people to do it, but we were among the first people to try to tell stories in Maps with video. And my book tour, which had been planned, with my publisher for some time, was canceled because I was invited purely by accident to speak at the FBI Academy. And all they wanted to know was how you use free, off-the-shelf mapping tools to create data sets to accomplish things like what we had done. And I ended up getting invited to a number of other law enforcement agencies and universities. And that's when I realized that what we had done and breaking the law and doing really stupid things in cars was not interesting. What was interesting was what we learned about mapping and sensors. And years later, I guess it would be 10 years later, I met Brian Selesky from Argo AI. The company was a year or two old. And he, by accident in the conversation, he said to me, "Oh, how'd you do it?" And I began talking about radar and laser and camera and mapping. And he says to me something to me which changed my life. He said, "So basically, you were using, for bad, all the technology that we use for good. You have an engineer's mind, but not the education. Have you ever considered how else you might use that knowledge?" And that's how I came to work in the self-driving car sector, which just goes to show that it doesn't really matter what your education is if you glue the pieces together in a productive and constructive way.
You're 100% right about education. I've spoken with Brian about education, and the thing I loved about Brian when we talked about education, he said, "I'd rather hire somebody that knows how to build something with their hands, with metal or with wood, because I can teach them how to program." You're going through this incredible process, and it was an incredible feat. How many hours of research did you put in and dedication and time to build this map?
Hundreds or thousands of hours. I mean, the time it took to prep the vehicle, install all the cameras, all the gear. This is 2005 when we were doing this. The technology was primitive. So the cameras were tape-based decks, like analog tape deck. They were digital video tapes. With 6 or 7 pencil cams on the car and one night vision camera on us, so to monitor our own cognition, and then bringing the tapes back, splicing them together, and then slowing the video down, and then marching through Google Earth. It was a terrible thing. Just to put that in perspective, today you can download Waze for free. And you're done.
Where did this passion come from?
If someone says something's impossible, I want to solve it. And if I can't, I want to invest in it. That's it. I had multiple startups prior to that. One was successful, one was marginal, and one failure. And I'm going to quote my co-driver from the Cannonball Drive, Dave Maher. He said something which better summed up the answer than I ever could. He wanted something money could not buy. The satisfaction of doing something that was difficult or impossible and doing it. My favorite book is a biography of Roger Bannister, the first man to break the 4-minute mile. And the book is called The Perfect Mile. And I read that book because in my search for understanding or logic or a plan around the Cannonball, I ran through all the biographies and autobiographies of drivers or racers. I couldn't find one that was written by a driver that was good or had any wisdom in it, except one book called The Racing Driver by Jenkinson. He was the navigator for Fangio, probably the best race driver of all time. And Jenkinson, who wasn't the driver, wrote brilliantly about passion and focus and what he described when Fangio was at his best as tigering, which is like a tiger. You are absolutely and totally focused on one task. So I moved beyond driving books and found The Perfect Mile. And Roger Bannister was unique in that he alone among the members of the Olympic team, it was the British Olympic team, was not a full-time athlete. At that point, he was a student. And he had a very public failure as an athlete. And in order to break the 4-minute mile, decided to reorient his research around, he was a medical student, around, I think it was oxygen depletion in the blood over 4-minute exertions, and constructed a treadmill specifically for his thesis, which also served the purpose of optimizing his own performance as a runner to break that record. And so because he was so short on time as a student and as an athlete, part of his practice and training was to run from his lab to his classes and dorm and back. And so this combination of qualitative and quantitative preparation and research was really what inspired me to think the way I did about it. Because I was not a professional race driver, and I was never probably good enough to be one, even had I had the budget to get better, faster cars. But I understood technology enough to assemble the tool set and to do the tedious work of assembling data sets in Microsoft Excel. Google Docs didn't exist at the time either. I don't think it existed. And assemble these pieces. Some people just like to solve problems, and that I chose that as mine.
You had your Bannister moment, but going before that, you're known as a driver, an individual that takes driving very, very, very seriously. You're the founder of the Human Driving Association. Why did you want to learn how to drive?
The driving came from my father, and this was more emotional. My father was before World War II. They were living in Poland and in Belgium, and when the Nazis invaded, they had no means of getting out of Brussels and getting to France. And the story my father told, which changed his life and mine, was that he and his older brother broke into a Citroën dealership and took the remaining vehicle, or I think the glass was already broken. The one remaining vehicle that had not been stolen by anyone else to flee the invasion was a hand crank Citroën from the 20s, I think. His older brother was 16. And think about it, when you're in the 30s, a 16-year-old, a car to them is like a child today saying, I'm going to have a plane. And they got the car started, and his older brother, my Uncle Jack, drove that car to Paris and saved their lives. My father, after the war, vowed that he would get in the car business and became an importer for Citroën, Peugeot, Renault, Porsche, and many other European cars. And for the rest of his life was in the car business and loved those cars. And today I'm very emotional about Citroëns and Porsches because that's what my father owned. But after he became a parent, drove very slowly. I almost say he never broke the speed limit. He drove very carefully because he had having kids changed his view on driving. Because when he was a younger man, he only drove sports cars, as I changed when I became a father.
You're a great father. You're doing things for your daughter, which, are impressive. And we've spent time privately together. And the way that I see you interact with your daughter puts a smile on my face because you're doing all the little things right. You're building sandcastles. You're going to the park. You're having fun. Your father has this life-changing moment in an automobile and goes on to make it his career. You're obsessed with the impossible. You've got all of the incredible backstory for a novel, and you go in, you meet with the FBI. What was that like when you met with the FBI and you said, "Hi, I'm Alex, and by the way, I'm not a crazy race guy. This is deeply passionate to me."
So actually, what happened was I was invited by God, so many years ago, I think I can say this. I was invited by an organization called InQtel, which does a variety of development and research for intelligence services and law enforcement. I was invited to be the speaker at their conference back in 2008, I think. And I found that baffling. I just couldn't believe they would invite me. So I didn't know what to present to them. And the gentleman who invited me said, well, we previously had the drummer for I think the Blue Oyster Cult or somebody had been there, and just tell your story. And I came and showed video from, at that point, the unreleased movie, a documentary about our Cannonball Run drive. And I showed video and I explained what I found to be, I think to this day, a very interesting, what I called my Rashomon moment. And for anyone who hasn't seen the movie Rashomon, it's the retelling of the same event from many perspectives, and how different perspectives determine one's understanding. And so there's a moment in our cross-country drive where we are spotted by police in Oklahoma. And the moment is recorded by cameras inside our vehicle. It's also recorded from a spotter plane that we had that followed us overhead. And we have audio recordings of the police. We have video from inside our car. We have video from the plane. But if you try to understand that moment by watching any of the video or listening to the audio, it's almost impossible to understand where the police are, where we were, the plane. I mean, we got lost. We were confused. And the irony of it and the lesson of that moment is that you can have too much data. You can have too much information to understand what's happening. You have to filter it. Data, actually, let me rephrase that. You can have too much data. All you need is information to make decisions. So information is really just data that's actionable. It's data that's sufficiently accurate and assembled to paint a picture of a moment that you can make a decision. And if you watch that movie, I'm not saying that you should watch this movie. It's a good movie.
I enjoyed it.
That scene in the movie depicting the moment of truth in Oklahoma is my personal Rashomon moment. So I showed it to this audience of people at this InQtel conference. And afterwards, I was approached by a member of the FBI and a member of the CIA and other organizations. And they all said the same thing. Could you please come show that again? The rest of the story is fine. We don't really care about the Cannonball. But what we really do care about is how you assemble a picture of a moment in time with accuracy. And so I went back home and broke down all the different cameras from inside and outside the car and the GPS data, because we had, I think, 8 or 9 GPSs in the car. These are early 2000 era Garmin units, consumer Garmin units. I think 2350s and 2510s were the model numbers, and compared that to the audio recordings of the communications from air to ground. And then it became even more unbelievable because all these GPS units we'd purchased, they didn't sync up accurately. Even though we'd start at the same time in New York and sync them up to the satellite networks, halfway across country, 1,400 miles into the drive, they weren't consistent with each other. And then I realized that technology can have its own Rashomon moments. And at the time, the phrase ground truth meant something different to me than it does today. At the time, like my ground truth then, I didn't know if ground truth was even possible based on how much evidence I had and how little information I could pull from the data. And that was the biggest lesson of going to visit the FBI. I'm still friends today with several of the agents I met, and we still laugh about that because they said to me, we have similar problems when we assemble, put an investigation together. I mean, you want to create a case. The bar has to be really high, very, very high. Your Cannonball stuff is that's like hobby level, but we admire your effort.
Alex Roy taught the FBI something.
Well, they already knew. They just wanted to get a different perspective.
You're being humble. You understand data because in 2015, 2016, and 2017, you broke the Cannonball Run records in a Tesla. You have to charge. What type of different, and we're more advanced in technology, what different data sources went into that? How did you map that charging strategy?
Well, that was 7 to 8 years after I had gone cross country in an internal combustion car. And at that point, tracking devices, a variety of tracking devices and GPS devices could be bought cheaply. In 2005, 6, 7, if you wanted to prove you'd done something in a moving vehicle, it was very difficult. You couldn't call up Ernst & Young or Tag Heuer to come and verify it. So you had to have multiple corroborating sources and multiple third-party witnesses. 7, 8 years later, you could just buy a tracking device or put an app on your phone. If you wanted to be safe, you needed 2 phones and 2 apps plus a tracker, so it'd be incontrovertible. And a lot of people, to this day, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the Cannonball records out there are not real. There's a few of them are, and some of them are not. I didn't really care about records, so we were not super. We didn't record with 7 cameras and all these witnesses and things. We just took a few tracking devices to prove that what we'd done. But that just shows the march of technology. It's really quite impressive how things can improve. Waze solved the research problem, and we weren't driving that fast, to be honest with you. The charging, I don't know if I want to call it a problem, but the charging situation and how we could optimize it was unknowable in the first attempt. If one goes back to 1915, the early days of internal combustion, car manufacturers discussed, to what extent I don't know, but I know that there were discussions regarding verticalizing vehicle design, manufacturing, production, sales, and gas stations, all in one, like what Tesla's done today with superchargers. So this was debated at one time, and the decision was made not for car companies, apparently, at least in the United States, not to own gas stations. So if you wanted to drive distance in 1915, 16, 17, you had to go to hardware stores and pharmacies to buy gas in a jug. And so the times were slow, and they were limited by your ability to get fuel. Road, interstate highway system didn't exist. So you are looking at vehicles that are not designed for endurance driving without a consistent supply of fuel, and wheels and tires not optimized for any kind of speed, and the roads couldn't handle it anyway. And yet a guy named Irwin Cannonball Baker drove cross country, nicknamed Cannonball because he had set the first Cannonball records. But the lesson of that era is not his time, not the times per se. It's that his times cross country fell as enabling technologies and decisions were made. For example, the first gas stations with fast pumps, or slow pumps, then fast pumps, then gas station networks that were regional. These were business improvements that enabled him to reduce his times. Then eventually better roads, and then better wheels and tires, more reliable cars. He was hired by Cadillac and Stutz and many car manufacturers to do this, to prove that internal combustion was more reliable and cleaner than coal-fired trains, and safer than going on horseback, and could carry more luggage. A lot of the improvements in mobility today that are cited in the development of autonomous technologies and green technologies were at the time applied to internal combustion in cars. So the interstate highway system sealed the deal, and then there really weren't a lot of more improvements to be made. But I looked at the history of gas stations and internal combustion and fuel and charted the improvement in times. Then I looked at charging networks over the last 10 years. So that's 2015. And I'm like, okay, people have gone cross country in electric cars multiple times. And the times have not improved greatly. There have been a few spurts here and there, but no radical improvements. But if one looks at the Tesla supercharging network and closely, one sees gaps, but one sees, and this is 6 years ago, a network where it's almost possible to go across using only their network at speeds that are better than what one would expect. So we went across west to east because you want to take advantage of wind resistance. the jet stream, you got to go west to east, back then at least. And there were a couple of spots where the chargers were too far apart to do any real speed. So you had to hypermile between them. Today, those gaps have been closed. And the supercharging network is probably twice as deep as it needs to be to do these things. And so on the first run, we had no idea what the optimal speeds were or charging regime would be. We have some idea because of the type of technology used in Tesla battery packs. And they're not the only ones who use it. You know that the first 2% to 50% is the fastest charging, and then it tapers. Based on factors like temperature, weather, and many other things, there are optimal speeds. In the years since I went, I think I went across with multiple teams, a guy named Carl Reese, Dino Mistraki. I also went across with Franz Aliquo and my friend Warren Honor. And oh my God, I'm spacing on the final drive. My co-driver, it'll come to me. We try different strategies. And what became apparent when I plotted the results is that the pace of improvement in battery technology combined with the improvement in thermal management software and optimizing for temperature, which you don't really have to worry about with internal combustion cars, that the improvements would outpace the improvements from internal combustion efficiency and gas station network construction 100 years earlier. So even though I was not convinced that the electric vehicle age would arrive so quickly, in 2014, I didn't believe it. But after 2 years of going across in Teslas and seeing the pace of improvement in multiple aspects of the ecosystem, it became very obvious it was going to come. And it also became obvious that it was inevitable that other companies would see that too. So people today can throw stones at other manufacturers building electric vehicles, and I don't know, Porsche, Mercedes, VW, Ford, whomever you want. What's going to happen, and it's already happening, is they are already nailing very well pieces of the ecosystem, but like their manufacturers in 1915, made a strategic decision not to own the charging networks. But competition, by its very nature, never changes. Competition always leads to improvements by anyone who plays. And so I am not only convinced of the electric vehicle era, but that electric vehicle ecosystems will evolve and there will be many winners. And this has been true of almost every technology-based business in history. It's never winner takes all. It's winners take most.
Thank you for pointing out winners take most. Everybody says, oh, Tesla's in the lead. They're never going to give. No, there's going to be multiple players. The Taycan's a great car. The Mercedes has their stuff coming. I love to know that you learned a lot. I'll use the word that you had a master class on these Cannonball runs of what you learned from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicles. Are teams from some of the large OEMs today running routes like, let's call them endurance runs, to learn feedback from the vehicles and how they react in certain climates and winds, and what is the true life of a battery? Are these tests being done today?
Well, I cannot speak for any OEMs because I don't work for one. I, over the years, have made a lot of friends at pretty much every OEM. There's somebody who read the stories of what I did 15 years ago. And I find it funny because I don't have any wisdom other than you've got to go test stuff. And the more you test, the better stuff gets. You pick a benchmark, test against it, and keep testing until you meet it. And there you go. So I don't know. I do know that a couple of electric car companies have reached out, not just to me, but to others. I'm retired from these things. I don't do this stuff. I'm in the safety business, but I've reached out to people who saw my example and have followed in my footsteps. Every record I ever set has been broken, I think. Almost, if not by a little bit, then by a lot. And this is the lesson of Roger Bannister and long distance running. Before he broke the 4-minute mile, it was said that no one would ever break the 5-minute mile, ever. And then it was. And then he broke the 4-minute mile and hundreds of people followed because they saw there was partially a psychological barrier and partially a scientific quantitative barrier. The science of sports and physiology is public. And so when I went across, it was believed that 30 hours across country was impossible. I did it in 31, breaking the prior record of 32. And since then, dozens of people have gone. And this is true of the electric records too. So I want to believe that every OEM's got an oval track, and they're running the vehicles in winter and summer and until the batteries go dead.
The brilliance of what you did, you're able now, as you said, you're retired, to give a master class, but you understood the value of a brand, building a personality. When you raced in the gumballs, you dressed up as police officers. Everybody knew Alex Roy, Cannonball brand, and it's done you really well. I'm sure it's opened doors. There was a photo a few years ago with Attorney General Sessions when you met with the Attorney General.
What's the question?
Why did you want to develop a brand? You obviously saw, it was deeply personal to you because of your father's history, but you understood early on the value of a brand and what it can do for you and the doors it can open. You and I have had many coffees. There was a coffee we had years ago at the Soho House in LA where we were talking about the value of brands. And you nailed it early on. Why did you develop the brand so early on?
I didn't know in 2002 what I was going to do beyond what I was doing. I'd had a couple of startups and I'd had a pretty good exit, and I was investing in real estate, and I wanted to get into technology more. And I had a tech startup, but I just didn't know. And because I was probably foolish and naive, I thought it'd be really easy to get into television. And over the years, I just thought, it's better to be, no matter what field you're in, you want to be at least entertaining. If you're going to pitch for money or pitch a company to take your money, you want to be entertaining. And I always had a sense of humor. And the fake police get up was literally this conversation. I said to my attorney, I'm going to do this thing driving cross country. And he says, you shouldn't do it. It's illegal. It's dangerous. I'm like, I'll do it as safely as I can. Is it illegal to dress like a police officer like they did in the movies? And he said, well, not as a foreign police officer. And so that's how the foreign police officer thing began. And the irony is, of course, that over the years of doing events, many real police officers thought it was hilarious. And they came to believe that because we always used a quantitative approach and we never had the best car. At the time, I couldn't really afford a great. Other people would take these Lamborghinis and Porsches. Like, my theory was, it doesn't matter. Like, that's all stupid. If you want to be safe, bring the best tech, bring the best plan. It doesn't matter how fast you go, or even if you're last place. Finishing is the number one thing. And as a student of endurance car racing, I knew that. So the police stuff was just a distraction, and also a method of financing the team. I went on eBay and bought jackets, uniforms, and sold fake police uniforms that I would sign for 10x over what I paid, which led me to make lots of friends and lots more enforcement, including a German police officer who began collecting my gear and he emailed me very offended. He's like, this gear is so fake. How dare you sell it? I like to buy one of everything you have and use it in a presentation. I'm going to deliver to the local police department. I don't know where, Munich. So, but the brand came later, and the brand came as a result of breaking the record and writing the book. The book was The Driver, and most of the book, half the book is probably devoted to our failures. The miracle of what we did isn't that we succeeded because of how much time and money we spent, but that we succeeded despite the mistakes I made. And I made the same mistakes that I've seen founders repeat and that I've repeated in the companies I founded. An obsession over the wrong things, an obsession over what the competitors are doing, a failure to launch or go, endless delays for no reason other than I don't want to say perfectionism is bad, but a refusal to define what readiness is. And so when I was giving the presentations to these law enforcement agencies and schools, they and I do a Q&A session, and this is where the brand became something beyond dressing up for fun. The Q&A sessions someone would always ask the question, if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently? How could you go faster? Like, what could you do to improve what you did? And the answer was never a piece of technology or more money. Oh, another question would be like, if you had $1 million extra, what would you do differently? And I speculated, well, if, 2 spotter planes, a spotter plane at night, we had a spotter plane in the daytime, better thermal cameras, we could see further. What a better car, but none of those things would have made a difference. There was a risk tolerance that I had. I was not willing to drive faster. I wasn't. Given the state of the art technology at the time, I was not going to drive faster. And I realized that I didn't have an answer because that was the best I was capable of given my risk tolerance. My co-driver wanted to go faster. I didn't feel safe. In the years that followed, many things happened that allowed people to go faster. But I would say one of the most important things was, and no one ever guesses this, the proliferation of active suspension systems in German cars. My car was a 2000 era BMW M5 designed in 1997 with some mild suspension upgrades and better brakes. But given the weight of the fuel and the gear we carried at speeds on the roads we drove, it would not have been possible to go faster safely. No. And in fact, a few miles, the car was shipped back to my garage after we did it. And a few miles of road testing after that, the rear axle broke from the stress of what we had done. But 7 years later, a gentleman named Ed Bolian broke our record. And he did it in a Mercedes CL, I don't know what model it was, but it had active suspension. He was able to carry twice as much fuel without risking damage to the suspension. And as a result, was able to reduce his stop time. And so this is a very important lesson, is that sometimes, human psychology is the barrier, but sometimes the technology of the time is what it is. And lessons are learned later as new technology unlocks and enables new performance, new doors are opened. And so I don't want to say I'm offended, but I always find it not offensive. When people say, well, second place is the first loser in any sport. And someone who says that is someone who's never competed or built or innovated ever. Because that second place person, I guarantee you, has walked away with a lesson that will change their life. And it's very important when someone else does better in any field of life, or especially business, to say, fine, good, I'm glad they did, because I will now learn, I will observe from how they did it, my next decision. And that's among the reasons I will never go back and Cannonball again. I learned my lessons, and now I apply them to other things in my life.
You're applying the lessons you learned to your life, but you're also applying it to the autonomous vehicle industry. I got a new nickname for you. You were known as the police officer, but you're now Roy Alex 00 Autonomous. Are you gonna start going online now and selling James Bond Alex Roy outfits now and signing them and having a fan club? At one point I wasn't entirely. I didn't really know. I had no plan to enter the autonomous vehicle sector. I was investing around it. I invested back in 2015, 16 in like a simulation company, and I was looking at ADAS, driver assistance companies. It wasn't until the death of Elaine Hertzberg in Tempe, Arizona, in the crash with the Uber self-driving test vehicle. That was a precipitating event, which led me to what I do now, working for Argo. But that was paired with meeting Brian Selesky, whom I had interviewed for the Autonocast podcast years earlier. And he connected the dots. He said, well, why don't you just use this knowledge for good? And for all the years in between breaking the record, until I had that lunch with Brian, I had lived in fear that somebody
would go get in a car and inspired by what I had done and hurt someone or themselves, because I would feel indirectly responsible. I was thrilled when so many people broke my record, because I felt like, okay, I'm off the hook now. But I still had this nagging thing. Like, I love driving. I'm always going to love driving. But I didn't know how I could ever contribute to road safety ever again. Like, what was I going to do? I could be an LP, like a small investor in a bunch of driver assistance companies. So when the opportunity came up to join Argo, there was, of course, it was a once in a lifetime experience to, I don't want to say it's a 180, a 175, to join a team and play even a small role in doing something which could make a massive positive change. I had no choice. I had to say yes. And I don't think a lot of people, very few people in life are lucky enough to have such an opportunity. And so I was going to take it. If it had lasted 1 week, I still said that was the best week of my life, because I could point back and say, that was a good thing. The other half of it is that Brian Selesky and Pete Rander and Argo are, I've said this many times, I found them to be the most honest and realistic people I'd ever met in the autonomous technology sector. Not only about the tech itself, but that even once it quote unquote works and is deployed, that it will not replace human driving as we know it. It's one more thing on the menu of ways we get around. And that made a lot of sense to me. And it makes even more sense today as the pace of deployments is unfolding. He was more right than I could have guessed at the time.
Brian's humble.
That's where he and I differ. I wish I had that kind of humility.
But the thing that, for our listeners that are listening, that I want to point out, ever since you joined Argo, every time I see you, got a giant smile, and you're always, always happy. So that says a lot about the company's culture.
Oh, it's a great culture. Yeah. I never had a corporate role of any kind. I was self-employed pretty much my whole life. And so it was, I don't know how to describe it. I never imagined a person could come along and convince me to do something, to work for them. And I suppose he did it by not trying to convince me at all. All he ever said was, how'd you do that Cannonball thing? I explained it, and he said, connect the dots for me. And then suddenly I realized that was the path I wanted to take. You will find that a lot of people there have exactly the same experience. Argo is not the only company with such a leader. In any sector, I think it's really important people do their diligence on the leadership, because it doesn't matter if a widget works if the leadership is no good. And now when I look at companies to invest in, or just in general, I assume that technology can be worked out. Over given time, technology is figured out. But if the product people aren't good and the strategy people aren't great and the leadership doesn't know that and pick great product and strategy people, none of it matters. And cuts both ways, because there's some great charismatic leaders out there who, where nothing else works or ever will. I mean, look at Theranos, right? And everything requires a structure. Why did I fail to go cross country the first big attempt? Because I didn't know enough about my car, and I didn't get a mechanic to come along and look at everything that mattered. On optimism and writing checks, I'm like, this is it. But if I'd gone to my own mechanic and said, make a list of the top 20 things that could fail and replace them all, it wouldn't have happened. Instead, what I said is, make a list of the top 10. And the 11th item, the fuel filter, is what failed. So, multiple overlapping redundancies, not just in technology, but in people and skill sets. Really, it's everything.
Brian understood you're obsessed with the impossible. You want to do good. Argo, I was very fortunate, years before you joined, gave me a tour and showed me the redundancy, and it was really, really impressive. The other thing, the most important thing to me that separates Argo from your competitors is a clear focus on no public timelines, and we are a business, we are a business, we are a business. Was this always like that since you joined, that, Alex, we're a startup, but we're a business, we're a business?
I mean, Brian has said exactly the same thing about Argo as the day I met him. And I think that's probably one of his greatest strengths. Consistency, honesty.
And that's going to reward you, and I know you can't comment on this, but I'm going to reference the Bloomberg article with the pending IPO.
If it's Argo, you're going to have to ask. You'd have to ask get it from the horse's mouth. So
I will quote the article where Brian mentioned an IPO is in the works, and that type of leadership and humility will serve him very well, will serve the company very well, and will serve investors very well in the public market. So if and when an IPO comes with Argo, I, as an investor myself, am looking forward to buying shares on the public market because I believe in Brian's leadership, and you're a friend and always want to support friends. But I want to move away from Argo here and look at the autonomous vehicle industry as a whole. Why do you think more companies in this industry are not focused on autonomy as a business? They're continuing to focus on perfection. But at the end of the day, you're never going to achieve perfection. You're going to run out of capital, and you're going to have a lot of people that are not happy. Why is that?
I don't know. I just don't know. I've been reading a lot of histories of business, and it is interesting to think that anyone who is trying to build technology at this scale and complexity has not studied the history of business, because there aren't a lot of technologies or businesses that will be this transformative. There are a few. They're all obvious. Shipping, aviation, railroads, elevators, electrical grids, space, although space is not a good one. I actually am not a big fan of using the space analogies because I believe the moonshot analogy it's really not helpful. In fact, I think the moonshot analogy in some ways may teach the wrong lesson. Because to go to the moon is with people on board, costly, difficult, hard to replicate. There are not a lot of economies of scale in going to the moon with people on board. And whereas autonomous vehicles are, in some ways, or a lot more ways, what do we want? We'd like them to be, beyond the obvious things like safe, we want them to be reliable and trustworthy. You want them to function invisibly, the way trains and planes do, the way a light switch makes light come on. So success is you don't think about it, but you do pay for it. That's success, right? And you trust it, and it's robust and reliable, and all the adjectives you want to apply. So if one goes back and looks at those histories, you can see that this is all played out before. And every successive technology and business built around it learns from the prior one, or at least the successful companies do. So that statement that Brian has made since the day I met him, it to me is that's the flag. Like, that's the good flag. This guy gets it. And businesses that function, that work, are like amplifiers for both the investors and the employees and the customers. Amplifiers of will and opportunity and profit and benefits in so many ways. So what good is the technology if nobody uses it or pays for it? Dean Kamen, inventor of the Segway, was on the No Parking podcast with Brian and I not that long ago, and he said something great. He said, the difference between invention and innovation is that anybody can invent something. And probably nobody will care. He's like, I've invented tens of thousands of things. He's like, but innovation is when people use it at scale. Innovation is getting an invention to market, and 20 more hurdles exist between invention and innovation. And so innovation is a very overused word but the people who understand what it means are the ones who change the world.
You're right. I like that you called innovation an overused word. It is completely overused. When you look at autonomy, you're focused on running it as a business. The whole leadership at Argo is. Cruz is focused on running it as a business, with Dan and Gil have publicly said that as well. Nobody truly understands, and I've said this for years and years and years, that the vehicle becomes a platform and you can build on top of it. And you just have to look at, I'm happy you mentioned history. Look at history. Profitable companies go on for centuries. Non-profitable companies go out of business. And we can look at a company today, largest company in the world based on market cap, Apple. What does Apple do? Apple makes a lot of money and a lot of profit. And if you're going to operate an autonomous vehicle and you start layering on services, and look at the margins in Apple services business, experiences, you give individuals the ability to buy their Kelly bag, their Birkin bag, have experiences, go to a sporting event, get that front row seat, not have to sit in traffic to have that wonderful experience. Now all suddenly you have the ability to expand margins. Now you got a ride that say would cost normally $6 to $10. You can charge $100, $200, and then, oh, by the way, you can get a commission off of the ticket. Okay, so that's another $200. You want to get a commission off the bag, that's another $2,000. All suddenly, you made, let's just do a broad number, you made anywhere from $600 to $1,200 profit on that ride. That's a business, because now you're in my favorite business, the expanding margins business.
Well, some of the elevators is an interesting business, because elevators were developed simultaneously in many different parts of the world and took different forms. And in Germany, in the 18th century, they were used primarily for mining. And they were so unsafe that the transport of human miners by elevator was banned until rope technology could evolve. But there was like a Russian czar. There was also somebody in France who built like private elevators for their castles. And then in London, and then later in New York, you had elevators used for experiences. They were, I can't remember it today, but in London there was I think it was called an ascending room. And it was built to raise ticket buyers above the skyline of London. And that was a major attraction, and presumably quite expensive. And it wasn't until years later that ascending room concept was brought to other countries, where they had taken more, I want to call it, not pedestrian forms. Commercial elevators were a thing, going back thousands of years. Later in the United States, there were multiple competing companies developing elevator technology. Some of them were experiential. For example, there was a man named Otis Tufts, no relation to Elijah Otis, whose sons later founded the Otis Elevator Company. But Otis Tufts, looking at elevator tech at the time with ropes considered unsafe, developed a screwdrive elevator and sold several of them into department stores. And people would go, and they were installed by the department stores because, as spectacles and experiences, the thought was that they would compel or inspire shopping. And so there was one in Lower Broadway. I forget the name of the department store. There was more than one. Eventually, as excitement over them declined and steel frame building structures proliferated and buildings got taller, Otis Tufts went out of business because the technology that initially had driven so much excitement and profit around experience didn't scale, because a screwdrive elevator could not go much higher, could not go any faster given the propulsive technology of the time. Although it was 100% safe, power went out, that thing was not falling. Didn't matter. If you build a taller building, you got people to the top floor, that experience sucks. What was previously a great experience became terrible. And so a lot of factors go into a successful business, and among them is evolving as parallel technologies evolve to ensure that the experiences you offer and the product you offer is in demand as demand changes. Not demand levels, demand type. And the good news about autonomy is that, and if you look at just a map, like the board game Risk, how do you win the game of Risk? It's not about rolling the dice. I mean, it is. But before you roll a single die in combat, you have to put your pieces on the board. And for anyone who's ever played Risk, it's a simplified board of the world with fewer countries, and you stack up your armies on the countries before you ever fight. And so if you put all your armies in one country on one end of the board that's in a corner, it's going to take a very long time to get out of that corner. While another player has placed pieces across the board, favoring map choke points that have access to more markets, more target countries. And the autonomous vehicle sector today is in the setup phase. It's the setup phase similar to the Risk board game setup phase. And if by placing your pieces strategically and wisely, you optimize and make it much more likely that you will have a dominant position at the end, even if there are multiple players, multiple dominant players, as opposed to the absurd notion that this technology, like any other, would ever be winner take all. It just doesn't make any sense. So as time passes, this will become more apparent to people who made, I don't want to say wrong calls, but the notion that this will be won overnight by anyone via software is absurd. But the notion that by putting the pieces in place now to execute on a medium to long-term vision is the only way that this is going to succeed.
You're right about succeeding. It's always the thing of like naturalistic driving where Argo is fitting into the community. It doesn't look like it's somebody that doesn't belong there. You understand the Pittsburgh left. But going back to the elevators and the experiences, you constantly have to be 2 and 3 steps ahead. You constantly have to, if you're a company, reinvent yourselves. Michael Jackson was great at constantly. No, he was. He reinvented himself incredibly.
So was Elvis.
Elvis was awesome. Let's get some blue suede shoes. Constantly reinventing. And I want to stay on the Elvis Vegas theme. So I have this going back to experiences. You have the little chapel people drive into Vegas to get married. You've got the Elvis impersonators. But Vegas is coming back. We had Resort Worlds, which recently opened. Gaming revenue in Las Vegas is going up. But what Las Vegas has now, which they didn't have then, they have gambling apps. You have the Bet MGM app. You have Penn National with Dave Portnoy's Barstool Sports. But the missing piece to this is autonomous vehicles. So you're Mr. Roy. You arrive in Vegas and you get picked up in an MGM autonomous vehicle. They already know from your phone. Okay, you get in there, Mr. Roy. You can start gambling the minute you get in that vehicle. And then when you arrive to one of the MGM properties, the concierge in the door knows, okay, welcome, Mr. Roy. You go right to your room, never go to a front desk, never get your credit card out because your credit card's already on file through the BetMGM app. You can gamble the whole way and say, okay, you want to go out to see a concert or you want to go to dinner. Okay, we're going to have the car for you. Gamble the whole way. We control the gambling experience. So the gambling is no longer just on the floors of the casino. The gambling is the entire Vegas experience. And now putting on my marketing hat here, only in Vegas. The tourism board of Clark County will get behind this thing like you wouldn't believe. Then putting on, and I stress for the audience, I am not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. If there's some way to profit off of those bets for the operator, you got a highly, highly profitable ride.
Well, I can't comment on the wisdom of that business. I haven't run the numbers. And also I don't gamble. I mean, in the sense that I'm not a gambler in the, I guess, purist sense. Although, every decision we make and every investment we make is a gamble to some extent. Well, it's an interesting idea. I mean, what do people want in life? They want to reduce inconvenience. They want to reduce friction in between A and B. B might be just the idea of fun. So if your idea of fun is that, then, and there are enough people who want that, that's demand, there might be a business there. The interesting thing about what you said, which I like the most, is, and I buy this totally, is the notion that all mobility is local. People say all politics is local, all mobility is local too. The way people get around this city is not the same as that. And the way people, based on weather, culture, and 1,000 other factors. So it makes sense that, and this is, I think Argo's been quite public about this, the recognition that every market is different and that it requires not only local data collection, mapping, and understanding of how a vehicle behaves in a local market, but once you get to productization, in other words, once the product once you deploy autonomous vehicles in a city, what is the product? How do you productize it? And who's the market? Where does it go? What does it do? What's the experience? Is that each city will have multiple products based on and around the autonomous vehicles. Some may exist today, but really what you want is to create experiences and products around autonomy that don't exist today. What is the number one lesson in entertainment is give them something they can't get anywhere else. And if you can, let them have it twice. And so it's the lesson of all media, of all entertainment, and it's the best lesson. How do you build a moat? The best moat is, these guys sold me something no one else could sell me. I loved it so much. The next thing they make, I want to buy that too. So the notion of a gambling-centric experience in Vegas may sound crazy to some people, but people are always willing to pay for something new and fresh and different, and that's fun. And that was true of, was true of elevators. How much did we learn about those ascending rooms? Today, real estate values are inverted in luxury buildings compared to 1850. Why? It used to be that the most expensive real estate was the ground floor, actually was half flight up, because horse manure in urban centers meant you don't want to live on the ground floor. So the wealthy lived half a flight up, and the servants lived on the top floor because you had to walk up. And today that's inverted because of elevators. So the ascending room, which was an experience available only to a few tourists in the mid 19th century, 18th century, 19th century, I forget the date. The ascending room is now a standard feature of every luxury building anywhere in the world. The top floor penthouse has built into it the experience that is only available for a few minutes when the first elevator came out. And you can see how that will also become autonomy as a feature will become commonplace, not because of inertia, but because of the expectation is that when I move from A to B in a vehicle with wheels, it will not only be safer than when I was driving, it will also deliver an experience I couldn't have if I was driving.
I want to follow on that theme. An experience that you couldn't have when you're driving. We're having gambling legalized in states across the country. DraftKings is very, very popular. FanDuel is very popular. The BetMGM app is very popular. And for our listeners that aren't familiar, MGM is actually two companies now. There's the REIT that owns the real estate, and then there's MGM, which owns the gambling. So they're an asset-light business, which autonomy at some point will become an asset-light business. The experience that you can only have, so we're in a state where gambling is legal, and there's a pro sports team. Okay, so imagine it picks you up at your house with a bunch of your buddies. You hop in there. It's got a bunch of beer. Already, all the gambling's all set up for you. You can gamble the whole way to the game. And then from your safety element, the vehicle will drive you home when you can't drive. And you can now you're intoxicated, so you're going to gamble more. I'm going to make more money. That's an experience that you can only have with autonomy. And from the business aspect, it's a highly profitable experience. There's going to be all these other experiences that emerge, and like you've been reading a lot about elevators and that. I've been reading a lot about gambling. I don't gamble, but I'm fascinated with the economics of gambling.
I also don't gamble, but I'm fascinated by the economics of it. We've seen this all before. Trains. Like before trains, how do people go long distance? By wagon train? That wasn't great. That was really tough. So think about all the things a train protected you from the elements. You could have dinner on it. I mean, what a lot better than eating dinner on a cart being pulled by a horse. You could get dressed. You could wash. I mean, and it was safer than having a bunch of horses pull you on an open terrain. And so, extrapolate from there what autonomous vehicles will do. I imagine that a lot of people probably will say, anyone who's driven in traffic and hates it is going to say, you're going to love this. And then anyone who's ever driven a Mazda Miata, Ford Mustang, or any number of fun to drive cars on a back road is going to say, I cannot wait to get back into those. And this is where my head's at. In the future, we're going to crave and love both those experiences. Right now, we only have like 1.5 of them. We can have sports cars in the back roads, but you don't want to take any fun car into traffic. We need to eliminate that. I mean, when I say need to, I mean, once the option is added to our menu of choices, an A to B trip will almost undoubtedly be better in an autonomous vehicle. But an A to A trip, meaning a trip to go nowhere, somewhere for no reason that ends at its starting point, is almost certainly going to be, well, not certainly, in a human-driven vehicle. But there's an exception, because there are experiences that are further out that are inevitable. For example, in 2000, at least 10 years ago, I became friends with a Broadway producer named Vivek Toire. And he wasn't famous at the time, but he had invested in a number of musicals like The Producers. He was one of them. And today he's working on, there's a comic book about the Beatles called The Fifth Beatle, and their original manager who passed away young. And he brought me in as an investor into a company called The Ride. And it was a two-way glass screen that went into the side of a bus. The idea was that the bus would travel through Broadway, Midtown Manhattan, and that the seats would face sideways, and that the people on the bus it was a new experience, would look out the glass and they would see on the street actors and performers. And then superimposed on top of the glass, you could still see the actors and performers, would be different backdrops of New York City. They'd superimpose characters and old buildings, and what New York was would change to the people on the bus watching it. And then they would stop and see a performance on the street, and then they would move. On the outside of the bus, they'd sell advertising. Now, this is revolutionary today. It was super revolutionary then. There were some issues with the glass. There were some issues with the business model. It didn't work out. But you can see how elements of that experience, which have today not come to fruition, will come to fruition with autonomous vehicles. Because you may not be able to get an entire bus full of people who want to go see the same thing at the same time in the country, but you absolutely will be able to get smaller groups of people, maybe even on a family level, to want to drive into say, places my father took me in the future, to the beaches of Normandy. Imagine if you could see a family-friendly version of scenes of Saving Private Ryan on the glass as you drive through. Imagine if you could travel through parts of Egypt and see it as it was 2,000 years ago. We are many years away from that being possible because, as you pointed out earlier, and Brian always says, this has to be a business. Even once, eventually, autonomous vehicles, the operating domain of them can go to places where such an experience might become possible, and we're a ways off from that because we're starting where it makes sense, and that's not the desert, and it's not the country, it's urban centers. But eventually, when that becomes possible, there are still other pieces to that business. There is the content itself. None of that content today, the movie Saving Private Ryan, its aspect ratio, the plot, the scene length, none of that is optimized for a ride through the Normandy countryside that might be 3 or 4 hours long. It's not optimized for families. And even if it was optimized, you need now different hardware and software in the vehicle. You need either a travel agency or media company or someone else to package it, productize it, market it, sell it. A lot of pieces have to fall into place. So when someone says to me, shows me a pitch deck today for an experience like I just described to you, that they want to launch in 18 months, I'm not taking that business seriously. But when someone comes to me with a clear business plan and says, we're going to do X, Y, and Z on this timeline in this place, and then we will scale, that makes sense to me, and not just in the autonomous vehicle sector.
You just described the future of Airbnb.
And I hope Argo. So.
If you look at the experience that you referenced in New York, it's all about augmented reality. This is going to be a giant moneymaker for autonomous vehicle companies, for mobility companies, and for Apple. At some point, Apple is going to introduce an AR app store. He'll probably start with some version of the much rumored glass, but as an Apple works their way into the car, they're going to augment that glass. And so you're on the bus or in a vehicle and you see those individuals acting out a play, and it's augmented reality, and perhaps you wanted to put Christmas in New York. Okay. Hey Siri, Christmas in New York. Okay, Grayson, 99 cents charge. Boom. Just augmented that into Christmas. And this is the beauty where Airbnb comes in. The fastest growing division of Airbnb is not the ability to book a hotel.
Is it the experiences division?
It's the experiences division.
I have some experience with them. Yeah.
It's absolutely phenomenal business. Brian Chesky, he understands it. And so will you imagine when you get into, let's call it Acme Autonomy Vehicle, and there's an app store and you can enable the Airbnb apps experiences. And, here you're visiting me now and say, we get in the vehicle and we're going to go have a pizza later and say, hey, Alex, you want to go fishing? And so I say, hey, car, fishing opportunities. And we book a fishing charter and we go out and go fishing, or if we want to go diving. That's highly profitable. That is the future of autonomy, is in vehicle commerce, and it's highly profitable.
Look, I had, a wonderful time. Brian and I went to go visit Barrick Moffat, who's the head of, I think his title is, it might be head of innovation, and let's just say he has an awesome title. I can't remember the whole title, at Universal Music Group. And we had a wonderful time discussing some of this on the No Parking podcast I do with Brian at Argo. And we talked about in-vehicle experiences around music. And as you described, I'd love to, glue it all together. I love Airbnb, and, if I go to Airbnb and then I can click a button, summon an Argo, but then I can also get a tour of a city and stop at music venues, and in between get an education about the musicians who played there, and then go to a show, and then the vehicle takes off and comes back and gets me. That ticks all my boxes, because all good businesses are, well, not all, friction reduction is the key, the core, foundational to any service business. And if, when it's hard to buy a ticket for a show, I just don't want to go. I just don't care. If the Ticketmaster app kicks me out I didn't click the thing in time, I'm like, maybe I don't want to go to the show. And that means there's a UX problem there. And getting pickups and drop-offs at concerts is sucks oftentimes. It really sucks. And the one thing since I moved to Miami, I've super noticed is it doesn't matter how nice the place is that you've gone, getting in and out, ingress, egress, pickup, drop-off, valets experiences is generally suboptimal. And I went to, where is it? The Edition Hotel. Mm-hmm. They have a pretty big driveway, so you can get in and out fairly easily. They manage their road space as well as they can. But Soho House is no better than the worst nightclub in the city. The traffic jam is unbelievable. It's a long wait. It's just not a great experience. People always talk about all the benefits of autonomous vehicles, and there are many potential benefits. But if they could just solve the convenience factor, that would make, I'd be really happy with that. But I think it's tip of the iceberg.
How great would it, if into the algorithm it knew that the venue got out at this time because of curfew hours, or this is when the concert was going to end, and so you didn't even have to take your phone out to summon it. you can go out there through augmented or some digital thing on the thing that says, hey, Roy, you're in this thing, away you go. And it already knows where you want to go if you're going to go to dinner after. That's the future, and the future is being built in Miami. You're new to Florida, and thank you for moving to Florida because we're so honored to have you here. What do you think about the future of autonomy in Miami? Miami is an incredibly vibrant city. What is autonomy going to look like in Miami in 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
I'd like to add an answer to the prior thing before I answer that. I would love if a system would know when the show gets out. But if you think about how many pieces have to fall into place for that to occur, and you step back, you realize what we really want is reliability. Like, you just want the ETAs to be accurate. That I might have to adjust my pickup time because of a crowd. I'm willing to do as long as the ETA remains accurate. If something is inaccurate twice, then no matter how safe it is, no matter how much I trust it, I have a different annoyance level. And I would like all these systems to start with just predictability, reliability, before they elevate into more elaborate levels of convenience. I want basic convenience to be reliable. I want that in all parts of my life.
You're going to get it there. There's no doubt it.
It'll all be, all of it will get there. But business, the future is built by optimists, but businesses are built in reality. And that's why focus and defining functionality and drawing a line and saying, this solves a problem. This is how we're going to solve it. We go to market. I'd rather have that product than the one that promises X, Y, Z, and ABC, but only does A and B and Z. Because if any one subcomponent or subfunctionality doesn't work, I get really annoyed. And everybody does. We all have that product that is great in so many ways, but isn't in another. The simpler a product is, the less it does, the easier it is to do everything well. And that's really what I think, who needs it? I don't care if an elevator goes from 1 to 100 in 2 seconds if the lights don't turn on. I don't like that. I get scared. What really led to the transition from elevator operators to non-elevator operators, it wasn't technological.
Reliability.
Not even reliability. It was the addition of an intercom, an emergency button, and music. Because all the other technologies, all the safety tech existed for a long time. But the UX, user experience, like the science of human psychology, wasn't understood in 1900 the way it's understood today. You couldn't get me into an elevator today with everything working perfectly if the lights don't turn on. So product simplicity matters.
And that's the brilliance of Argo. And that's probably, why you joined, because I have these grandiose ideas and we're not there yet. And you're a realist because Argo is clearly grounded in a business and understands how to operate a business. And Alex, we've covered a ton of ground during this podcast, and I'd love for you to leave it with us. What would you like our listeners to take away with them?
I think it's really important that people listen to opposing views and understand that the stories that we hear about from friends, from the media, often oscillate around what's actually happening. And if you look at what the media said about planes and blimps and radio and trains and cars and electricity and nuclear power and whether or not we should go to the moon and whether or not in World War II, who's going to win, the reality was always right there. And yet conversations oscillate around reality. And so taking a breath and stepping back and asking others and oneself, is it really this simple? Because reality generally isn't that simple, but it's still there and it's right in front of us all the time. And the best conversations, the most is learned by talking not just to one person, but multiple people with whom we disagree. We might not all disagree in the same ways, but the reality is there. And I imagine that we're going to look back at this era and say, oh, it was so obvious. It was so obvious to anyone who was looking. And yet not enough people are just looking right now. Just look.
We need intellectual curiosity, individuals to interact and meet individuals with opposing views, and read books and challenge yourself, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's a lot of individuals that have a lot of really great ideas if you just listen to them and don't put up blinders. Be welcoming to intellectual conversations. Have intellectual debates. They're fun. You can learn something. You can get exposed to a point of view that you might not have thought of. Something might have triggered you in your head. You might order a book on that topic and read them like, wow, this is really interesting. And, thank God that we're here in Florida where we can get together face to face and have really interesting conversation. Because Alex, you're an interesting gentleman.
Oh, thanks, Grayson.
You're a smart gentleman. And every time we get together, I learn something. So thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy for this incredible conversation, because the future is bright. The future is autonomous, and the future is autonomy as a business. Alex, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks for having me. I also would like to just add that I'm working on something really important at Argo called groundtruthautonomy.com, which is kind of the yin to the yang of the No Parking Podcast, which is an attempt to put out like honest, reasonable, and educational content around autonomous vehicles, and not just autonomous vehicles, and not just about Argo. Because we both know from your podcast, or at the time my podcast, that there just isn't enough out there about what's happening. And if one goes only by pop culture depictions of robotics and AI and autonomous vehicles, we're not being well served by pop culture.
And that's why, listeners, you should read Ground Truth Autonomy, because Alex just calls it like he sees it, and it's really well written. His articles on the levels was really interesting, but all of your content there it's a really good intellectual debate. So, Alex, keep writing really great stuff, and I'm looking forward to reading many more.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.